What's up, YouTube? Welcome back. So, I was browsing around the Bureau of Labor Statistics website, looking for some, interesting studies and reports to read and perhaps to share with you guys. And I ran across this article, and this article is about the Great Migration of, as they put it, Afro-Americans, but I'll say African Americans, that took place between 1915 and 1940. And I read the article. It's about 3 pages long, not a long read. And I was like, oh, wow, this is pretty cool information. It's like something that you heard about and perhaps know a little about, but the article really kind of, you know, provided more information and insight, right? So, in honor of Black History Month and all that carrying on, I want to talk about this article. And the article was published in the Bureau of Labor Statistics periodical called quote unquote Monthly Labor Review in March 1987. All right. And again, the article is 3 pages long, very short and to the point. All right. So I just want to go through and sort of give you a summary and sort of just share some information that I found really interesting, because this really is sort of something that we don't really learn about, even amongst ourselves when we talk about African American history. This is something that we really don't speak on, but I think something that really is significant in the Black population in the United States, right? I guess, could we say perhaps the Black diaspora in the United States or within the United States, perhaps? Yeah. All right. So here we go. I just want to share some things with you from the article that I found really interesting. Okay. So between the world wars, between World War I and World War II, more than 1 million Black Americans left the South to seek opportunity and fuller citizenship in the North. And I think we all kind of have heard about that, right? Some of us even have relatives, perhaps, who are either you live up north and you have relatives from the South, or you live in the South and you have relatives up north, right? And also, some places have like high up north have high Black populations, like New York, New Jersey, Ohio, Illinois, right? And I know for people who live in Illinois, especially Chicago, like there's like Black people who have like a strong connection to like Mississippi. And I just think that that perhaps was, when people from Mississippi were moving up north, they probably ended up just going straight up north to like the Midwest, right? That perhaps was a factor too. And perhaps because there was like a lot of job opportunities in Chicago, as well as say, in Ohio, in New York, in Jersey, wherever, right? All right. And this article is by a man named Spencer R. Crew. And Spencer R. Crew, at the time this article was published, I don't know if he still is, but is or was an historian at the National Museum of American History, Smithsonian Institution, and curator of the exhibition Field to Factory, Afro-American Migration 1915 to 1940. All right. So that's just a little bit about the author who wrote this article here. All right. So the Great Migration of African Americans was largely, from largely rural areas in, southern states, right? So they were the Black people who migrated up north. They were largely coming from rural areas in the South, right? And they were migrating to urban areas up north. And, this migration altered the economic, social, and political fabric of American society. It made regional problems of race and socio-political equality national issues, and gave Afro-Americans or African Americans a role in the election of northern political leaders, in contrast to the absence of a political role in the South. All right. So as far as the profile of the black workers from the South who moved up north, they were like a mixture of farmers, domestic servants, day laborers, and industrial workers. They came from all parts of the South, hoping for a chance to improve their own station or at least that of their children. Okay? So, what triggered this is very interesting. Um, World War I and World War II helped trigger this migration. It was almost like a perfect storm. Let me explain. All right. So, without the increase of job opportunities caused by World War I, the Great Migration might never have occurred. Okay. Fighting in Europe dramatically increased the demands on companies in the United States to produce ammunition and other goods to support the war efforts. You know. And by the way, this is the article. I forgot to show that to you guys. All right. All right. No. All right. But back to business. All right. So again, fighting in Europe dramatically increased the demands on companies in the United States to produce ammunition and other goods to support the war effort, right? At the same time, the labor pool these companies normally depended upon, immigrants and native foreign Americans, was dwindling, right? The draft took away many of these men, while the turmoil in Europe disrupted the flow of immigrants from that area. Because some people were saying, well, couldn't they just use white workers? Well, white workers, particularly the men, were drafted to war, right? Then there was also an influx of European immigrants in the early 20th century, right? But because of like the issues going on in Europe, that immigrant flow was disrupted, right? So again, two strikes to the labor pool that these companies usually draw from, okay? So, desperately in need of additional workers, northern businesses look southward for new sources of labor, okay? Because African Americans make up a large portion of the unskilled workforce in the South, and because of social conditions there, they became the target of aggressive recruitment campaigns, which I didn't know that they were actually campaigns for this. I just thought it was more like just word of mouth, right? It was like, you hear somebody say, hey, there's some jobs up north. Kind of like, to an extent, how it works even now, even with like so much technology, it's still sometimes word of mouth, still. All right, so northern companies offered well-paying jobs, free transportation, and low-cost housing as inducements, for African Americans to move north. And they also sent labor recruiters into the South who received a fee for every recruit they provided to the company they represented. All right. So, these companies must have been really in need of some labor force, of some laborers here, some workers, right, to do this, right? So, like I said, it's like a perfect storm, right, that helped kind of create this migration of Black Americans moving up north. Some, not all, some. But, historically and currently, I believe the highest population of Black people reside in the South, by the way. All right. The socio-economic and political conditions in the South made African Americans likely candidates for migration. All right. In the system of Jim Crow laws, Black Americans, under penalty of imprisonment or possibly death, were forced to use special sections where they rode on public transportation. When they rode on public transportation, ate in restaurants, or attended theaters, right? We all know about segregation in the South, right? We all know about that. Um, but also, these southern states, excluded them, black folks from voting, thus having a political voice through manipulation of the law, such as the grandfather clause or grandfather clauses, poll taxes, literacy tests, and I think, just random tests, even, right? So this was a factor in some black people saying, hey, let's try moving up north, right? You know, and of course, that was just the political situation. The economic situation was even more oppressive, right? Because you had that whole sharecropper situation in the South, right? That locked the farmers into a cycle of debt. That was usually how it was set up. While the majority of Black Americans in the South resided in rural areas, they did not own the land that they worked on as farm laborers, right? So they didn't own the land. So most often they rented it from large landowners or worked as farm laborers. Bad crop years, boll weevil attacks, floods, or low crop prices often destroyed profit margins and left sharecroppers in debt to the landlord. In order to avoid imprisonment, they agreed to work additional years in hopes of paying off their debt. Unfortunately, profits rarely were large enough to wipe out their debt and obligations, right? So Black people still kind of found themselves in some sort of a very exploitative and practically slavery-esque situation, right? Migrating offered a chance to escape the oppressiveness of the South and to begin a new life, right? So then we get into the problem of taking leave taking. All right. Think about it. Making that transition from the South to the North, especially during that time, seemed like a major deal, like a pretty big deal, right? As far as like the logistics are concerned, right? You know, of course, the mentality and the culture and all that stuff, but just as far as the logistics are concerned. But it should be remembered that African Americans had strong ties to the South, and migrating meant severing lifelong friendships and strong family bonds. So them moving up north, they kind of had to give up that. It's almost like, social network and even security system that they had. Migrants rarely left in large groups. More often, they left alone. They usually departed with the expectation that they would return, or would send for loved ones. But migrating always involved leaving behind loved ones for an uncertain future. Migrating north also meant leaving familiar surroundings and community institutions which provided support in times of need. Right? Church activities, social clubs, and fraternal organizations were part of a vibrant Afro-American community in the South, which provided a buffer from the indignities they faced outside the community. So, some Black people, as we know, did not move up north, perhaps because they really had something good for themselves going on in the South, as I just mentioned, right? So perhaps they were in a good place, right? While hundreds of thousands of African Americans chose to leave the South, More remain behind or return after visiting northern cities. Uh, Leaving was a complicated process, y'all. Leaving was pretty complicated. Southern officials tried to slow the tide of migration by arresting or detaining African Americans who tried to leave. Local police regularly searched departing trains for people they thought might be heading north. All right. Um, so to escape police scrutiny, black folk pretty much had to sort of go at night, like let night cover your tracks, so to speak, and escape at night. As well, aren't black people supposed to be free right now? Didn't slavery end? But again, we're on this Jim Crow thing, so it's like, yeah, slavery ended, but you still have these laws that still restrict your day-to-day life. And you can't even leave without somebody feeling like they have ownership of you and telling you what you can and can't do as if, they own you, right? And also, when it came to their property, sometimes they would either sell their property or belongings secretly or only take what they could carry with them. So they couldn't really take a lot. So it wasn't like they were having like U-Haul trucks and moving up north. It wasn't like that. They just had to take what they could carry, because that would set off and alert these racist Southerners that, hey, they're moving up north, So they only could take what they could carry with them, Yeah. And as we know, most migrants were working people who didn't really have like a lot of money, let's be real. And leaving under these conditions and circumstances hurt them financially. Like they had to leave items behind or give them away. Usually when they did sell them, they didn't really get top dollar for them because folks knew they were moving, so they had to get rid of the item, right? So therefore, many migrants, like they didn't have enough money with them to tide them over for long periods of time once they reached the north. So when they hit north, they had to hit the ground running. Finding a job became an extremely high priority as soon as they arrived. Some people perhaps were in better situations where they perhaps had a familial tie with someone up north, so they could probably stay with them until they got on their feet, right? I know within my family, my situation's a little different because a little bit. I'll give a little bit of information about my family history. As far as I know, my grandparents, they didn't move north. My grandparents on my father's side were already up north. All right, they were in Ohio. And my grandparents on my mother's side, they were in the South, but they moved west to California. And my grandfather on my mother's side was a part of the military in the Army. So I think that probably helped too. And as far as my grandmother, let's see, my grandfather was from South Carolina, and my maternal grandmother was from Louisiana. And for them, that familial tie when they moved to California was a real big help since someone was already there. And that's how they did it, right? Whereas like you kind of move each other out like one at a time until somebody gets on their feet, and then you move the next person out, they get on their feet, that sort of a thing, right? So next we'll just talk about the northern lure, as they put it in this article. Why did people want to move up north? All right. So one of the key factors influencing the individuals who did leave was the letters and visits they received from friends and relatives who already moved north, right? Word of mouth, right? Like, especially if you ain't really hitting on much in the South, and you're like, well, and you're hearing stories about all this, grandeur up north. It's like, oh, maybe I should move up north, right? Prior to World War I, African Americans moved north in small numbers, but their economic opportunities have been severely limited. Um, you know, so they didn't really have like a lot of economic opportunities, despite being up north and despite the North supposedly, you know, not, being racist, right? Supposedly, right? Um, but when the war changed the job markets, earlier migrants wrote letters home urging others to come north because, the job market popped off, right? Like there's so many jobs up here, like, come get some of this work here, right? um, and, having someone to live with or a clear idea of where jobs were located, removed some of the uncertainty of leaving, right? Like today we have it like a whole lot easier when it comes to moving than back then, right? Just with technology alone, we have it much easier and so many different options as far as moving is concerned, and also just being less restricted, in terms of like oppression and discrimination, right? But these people really were like, low-key pioneers, right? You know. But the North wasn't exactly the utopia that you perhaps would think it would be. And let me explain. All right. While job opportunities were readily available in most cities, these jobs were at the lower end of the occupational ladder. Okay. Northern labor unions generally did not accept African Americans as members and often threatened to strike companies where non-union workers performed union jobs. All right, so there's that discrimination aspect again, and using the system to discriminate and sort of create and create boundaries and limit people, right? Which still low-key goes on today. It's just more covert. All right. But next, even when African American workers acquired better paying jobs during the war, many of them had to relinquish these jobs once the war ended, since the people who were drafted were now coming back to the United States and thus needed a job, particularly white men, which is terrible because you have been doing this job for a long time and all of a sudden you got to give it up, you know. But as far as the type of jobs that African Americans did, typically they wound up in dirty, back-breaking, unskilled, and low-paying occupations. All right. These were the least desirable jobs in most industries, but the ones employers felt best suited for their black workers. Right. Back-breaking labor, basically just borderline slave labor. Right. um, Only a relatively few obtained work in semi-skilled or skilled occupations. Mostly it was unskilled labor. All right. And that's about black men. But when it came to black women, the situation was even worse because occupational choices for black women um, were even more limited because few of them, in concordance with women in general, had access to industrial jobs, right? While some women found employment in the garment industry, packing houses, and steam laundries, the majority of African American women worked as domestic servants or in service-related occupations. While none of these jobs paid high wages, they paid more than African Americans could obtain for similar work in the South. However, you got to factor in the cost of living now, right? Because it's more expensive to live up north, especially in urban areas now, right? And generally, living up north was more expensive than living down south. Um, African Americans have paid you know, had paid nearly twice as much as their white counterparts for equivalent housing. So there was like this housing market discrimination that sort of took place too, where they're charging African Americans more, even though African Americans statistically got paid less, right? Higher rents made it harder for them to make housing payments, and they often had to take on boarders or other family members to help meet those expenses, right? Um, so while they earned better wages in the North, much of the increase was offset by the higher living expenses, the higher cost of living. So it's like, did black people really get ahead in the North? That's debatable, you know. um, More than economics. This is the last part of it. Yeah. So, economic gain was not the only reason African Americans came up north. All right. Better educational opportunities and greater personal freedom were also motivating factors. Up to the time of migration, African American children rarely advanced past the 6th grade in the South. I did not know that. But I guess it shouldn't be a surprise, but I didn't know that. Quote unquote, black schools received very little money from Southern legislators, especially at the secondary level, and landlords placed pressure on parents to put their children to work rather than to have them further their education. Under these circumstances, only a relatively few children were able to receive a high school or college education. In contrast, northern cities and northern states allocated more money for education and had compulsory attendance requirements that forced students to stay in school longer. And as well, there wasn't segregation, so black people were able to access those opportunities versus in the South where that access was restricted, right? Thus, that partially where the civil rights movement was sparked from, right? Another variable that made Northern life attractive was the sense of personal freedom migrants felt after leaving the South, right? They can move about the city without the fear that the wrong word or tone or action would result in an arrest or a more severe or even violent response from racist white folk. But as far as black migrants being welcomed, these migrants were not always welcomed by residents of northern cities. Both black and white urban residents worried about the impact of so many new people, and on occasion they sought to discourage migrants from coming. And northern urban areas presented their own set of problems and adjustments for migrants once they reached the new destinations, right? So, the North had its set of problems and the South had its set of problems. The North had its upside, and believe it or not, the South had its upside too. But despite all these difficulties, African Americans continued to migrate north and to stay, as we know. With the many adjustments migrants face, strange environments, new neighborhoods, and different ways of behaving and dressing, most found northern cities more engaging than the places they left behind. Though many migrants returned south regularly and referred to it as home, they did not remain. The South appeared to hold their hearts, but the North held their futures. That's pretty much the end. And so a very interesting article about a piece of Black history that that you don't really hear about as much, of course from mainstream education, but perhaps even, Black folks, right? And as well, think about your family history. Do you have, like some people who watch my YouTube channel do live up north, you know? perhaps, you can have a conversation with your parents or grandparents, and, or either you already know what it is, right? But, just find out, perhaps maybe why they perhaps decided to leave, their personal reasons, right? However, this is off subject a little bit, but I believe data for African Americans was like data for African Americans, like between the period where slavery just ended up to the First World War was pretty spotty, right? The government really didn't keep much data on African Americans until they wanted to implement the draft. Then they had to get data on African Americans so that they could draft them. So that was probably like the first. So if you look for data for African Americans, it may probably only go back but so far, and there may be a gap within the data, perhaps. Just a little FYI for you guys. But also nowadays, the migration seems to be in reverse. If you notice that, Black people and people in general are starting to move south. And possibly to escape higher living expenses, high taxes, brutal winter weather, to seek job opportunities, to be in areas that have a high Black population, or at least a high urban Black population, in urban areas. But for me personally, where I live, I do see a lot of out-of-state license plates. Many of them do come from up north, as well as other areas too. But I've gone on for long enough. Didn't mean to go on for so long, but I really thought this was interesting, and I wanted to share this with you guys and just get your take on it and see what you guys think about it. So thanks for watching. Please feel free to comment. Until the next video, adios and goodbye for now.